My name is Siobhan Carter-David, and I'm Associate Professor of History and Affiliate Faculty in Women and Gender Studies at Southern Connecticut State University. My research deals with fashion and racial uplift as it's been presented in African American magazines. I became interested in this topic when I was in graduate school after I changed my topic from one that focused on hip hop and Black nationalism. And I had some supportive faculty members on my dissertation committee, which thought it was a great idea because this issue connects to so many issues in American and African American history. What my work looks at specifically is the post-civil rights era. So I started around 1970, I end around 1993, 94. And what I engage with in my book, tentatively titled Issuing the Black Wardrobe, Magazines, Fashion, and Uplift in Print. So what this book is doing is looking at the ways that African American magazines in the post-civil rights era, when there's presumably less investment in the white gaze, looking at the ways in which African Americans used fashion to uplift the community through fashion instruction. This fashion instruction happened through ads, it happened through editorials, pictorials, editorial pieces. What we see on the cover of magazines impacts this greatly. The way that editors respond to the reader, letters to the editor. And so all of these come together to give us a way of understanding how African Americans who had access to these magazines thought about fashion, how they responded to it, but also what the editors and writers and advertisers are thinking. And, you know, really what I come up with is this idea that, you know, African American magazines are dealing with fashion in ways that are culturally specific, in ways that highlight African American culture, African American difference, African American cultural pride, but also, you know, spoke to notions of assimilation, right? How do we assimilate into this space, particularly since I'm writing about an era where we see the emergence of corporate culture, the growth of the Black middle class. We see feminism is being engaged across the nation, and so Black women are part of that. We also see a casualization of fashion that happens for all Americans across the board. So how do African Americans in particular deal with fashion instruction in magazines in this moment that we see a major shift happening across the world, across the nation, in general, but in ways that are different for African Americans in particular. I surveyed dozens upon dozens of magazines, about 98% of which are defunct now. Maybe 2 or 3 of them are still publishing. Some of them had very short runs, some of them had long runs, some of them are regional magazines, some of them are fashion specific, some of them deal with lifestyle in general, and fashion is just a part of it. Some of them are for children and teenagers, and others, you know, are for the general African American audience. And magazines are important too and play as much of a role as fashion does in the work that I do, because magazines are a vehicle that's used post-segregation in a moment of integration to unite African Americans in ways that newspapers didn't necessarily do by the time we get to the 70s and 80s and early 90s. I begin in 1970 because there's several magazines that are publishing in that time that emerged that year. And I end in 93, 94 because there are other magazines, notably Vibe magazine, which was a hip hop magazine that was heavily backed by Time Inc. And, you know, it sort of ushered in a moment of the acceptability of hip hop culture. And so I focused really on these 23 odd years of African American culture. I am a cultural historian. And I think fashion is a very, very important part of American life that needs to be, I think, more frequently engaged. I have found that in Europe and in Asia, they are way more receptive to fashion studies as a legitimate scholarly topic to be studied, and not as much as we would like it to be in the United States. And so we have seen several books of late emerge that deal with African American fashion in particular. And so I think we're going in the right direction, and I'm glad to be a part of that change.